there and visit the top up there, you can walk around that platform up there and look around these Smoky Mountains here. And it was the end of his shift, but instead of coming down those stairs or actually riding in the elevator, he wanted to be a hotshot 18-year-old. He decided he was going to surf the elevator down. Now, they said that they've done that before. They've actually rode on top of one elevator to work on the other, so it was kind of a common occurrence here. But this time he was just doing it for fun, they say. And he opened up the gateway and went to step out on the elevator, but he didn't realize how far the elevator was down. So he fell really far and hit really hard on top of that elevator. But you know, they use grease to operate any type of machinery like that, the cables and gears and things like that. So he slipped on top of that grease. And they say that his body got wedged between that elevator and those beams right there and ended up crushing his body. Now the people inside, they had no idea what was going on. They just heard this thud and a scream. Then all of a sudden the elevator stopped working. See, his body got wedged in there so tight it jammed the elevator. On April 11th, 2016 at 5:40 in the evening, he bought a ticket and rode that elevator all the way to the top up there. Now they say when he got up to the top, he walked out to the front of the platform and he jumped. When he jumped, his body hit the arcade building on the way down and it decapitated him instantly. So both his head and his body went rolling down the sidewalk right where we were all standing just a little while ago. Now, wouldn't that be a wonderful way to start a tour? Have a body land right in front of you? Or perhaps end a tour for some of you because you might leave after that, right? But they say if you come back on April 11th, and if you're going up there to taking any photos around here, they say that you may come across his spirit up there. And they say that you can take a photo of a guy that's standing up there weeping, and then all of a sudden jumps. And when you look around, there's no body there. And you can take as many photos tonight as you want. Maybe you can catch him up there weeping. The church came out of these mountains. They believe that energy came along with the stones, and perhaps some of the apparitions that people see here came along with those stones as well. But people see things here like floating lights and shadows on the outside of the building. But there are two full-body apparitions that people actually see inside the building. The first one is a preacher. They say he stands at the altar looking at his congregation. He usually stands there for about a minute or so just smiling at his people, and then he just disappears. But then there's a woman that stays there that shows up every now and then, and she usually sits there about 3 or 4 minutes, and she sits there reading her Bible in the third pew on the right-hand side, but she never turns the page. But after about 3 or 4 minutes, she finally just stands up, closes her Bible, and then disappears. Now, nobody knows what happened in the past, and it's kind of replaying itself. You see that a lot of time on battlefields where you see the soldiers kind of reenacting the battle there. What they believe here is when people walked around with torches before they had electricity, and that's what the floating lights are that people are seeing. And then, of course, the shadows are cast from those torches. But there has been people who've spotted apparitions or shadow figures actually walk through the front doors and sit down in the congregation here. So that's a little bit harder to explain. The tour kind of got freaked out a little bit, but I assured them this is still an active church. They still do services here today. And that's a set of stairs, and somebody was just walking down the stairs there. So those faces will show up every now and then. Don't panic if you see somebody moving around in here. But yet the center section of it, 30 feet of it's glass, so you can walk across and look down and see the ground below you as you walk across there. Because in August of last year, we did have something happen there. It was 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, and they had closed the gates to the bridge. But they had somebody that was up there that jumped across the gates and started running out towards the center of the bridge. Now security was running after him. They didn't want anybody playing around up there, especially after they closed down. But when the guy got to the center of the bridge, he jumped. He jumped 165 feet to his death right there from that sky bridge. Now later on, they did find a note that said he intended to commit suicide, and he apparently succeeded here. Now we had the guy that jumped off the Space Needle there in 2016, and the guy that jumped off the bridge here now. But believe it or not, a month before this happened, we had a lady that was riding up the skylift going to Anakeesta, and she got about 3/4 of the way up. She lifted up the bar and she jumped as well. Now she only jumped 30 feet, but it was enough to kill her. And she also intended to kill herself as well. Now you may have heard about her in the past. In 2018, she crashed the gates of the White House trying to get in there. So you may have heard about that story there. They said that she had some drug problems and she had some mental issues as well. She thought her husband was the president and her children were trapped in the White House. So you can look up that story and read about her. But she lived here in Tennessee, and I guess she was looking for a good place to kill herself, and she came to the skylift here. Some people believe she was off her medication, but she was riding up to Anakeesta there. So it seems like cemeteries, but y'all on a ghost tour, so I imagine y'all like to come to a cemetery, right? This is where all the ghosts like to hang out anyway, so good chance to see them here. You're looking straight over the Space Needle right through these trees here. And so it's kind of crazy that anytime the family visits or anybody comes and visits his tombstone, they're having to look straight at the place where he died right there. And they get a lot of readings in here and they'll pick up things like shadow figures, EVPs, things like that. But the first thing I'm going to tell you about is the Gatlinburg witch. Now the Gatlinburg witch is back here in the cemetery. She's known as a nesting witch. Now nesting witches will grow creatures in their body. When those creatures develop, they cut themselves open and let those creatures out. And in her case, it's birds. So some people believe the birds around here, some of them are her eyes and ears, and they're watching and listening for her. But if you want to see her, the best time to see her is if you come up here when there's a new moon or full moon. They say those are the 2 nights that she'll rise. And sometimes you come up on those nights, you see a lot of birds here in the cemetery, or hear them calling in the back. They say they're calling for her to rise. And when she does, it's usually around these big trees right back here in the corner. And she'll walk back and forth across the back of the cemetery all night long. And she'll walk until early dawn, and she'll find a spot just to sit down, and then she just disappears. Now some people believe she's trapped just outside of the cemetery, and she's trying to get in, and that's why she stays in the back there. The cemetery can be seen daytime or nighttime. It doesn't matter when you come up here, you have a chance to see them. There was actually a couple that was visiting here from Oklahoma one day, and they saw a shadow figure sitting on one of the headstones, and when they turned and looked at it, it disappeared. But right after that, they were pushed and then scratched. There's been several people who claim they've been pushed by a shadowy object behind them, or tripped by a shadow figure running in front of them. So they believe the shadow figures here can get kind of aggressive, pushing people, scratching them, tripping them, trying to keep them out of the cemetery. Some people believe maybe it's the soldiers that are buried here. Maybe they don't want people to walk around the cemetery.
I see a guy.
I'm really a ghost. I'm a ghost guy. I'm a ghost bear guy.
I would fall down this hill in a heartbeat.
Shops in here, so you can get anything you can imagine in this area right here. But this area was actually built back in the 1970s, and when it was built, they wanted it to look like an old Eastern European village. So they brought in a lot of lumber from old barns and old churches and old houses. They wanted to give it that rustic look. And ever since it was built, they've been getting shadow figures and seeing shadow figures and getting EVPs, especially around the big fountain in the middle that we're going to pass. And some people will say, well, maybe there was something attached to that lumber when it was brought here. Maybe one of those buildings was haunted, and that's why people are seeing the shadow figures get the EVPs here. But other people say, no, it's just them coming out of the cemetery. We're so close to the cemetery, it's the spirits coming out of there. And if they are coming out of the cemetery, it's probably because there's a good donut shop around the corner here, right? That's what. Shop. As you can tell, I enjoy candy, and this is one of the best places around to get it. But this candy shop was actually built back in 1954. The family that built it were candy makers on their way to California, and they were just passing through here, and they saw all the tourism here, so they wanted to take advantage of that. So they started making candy in their garage in the early 1950s, sorry. And in 1954, they ended up opening this candy kitchen here, if I can get it out. And the same family that started this candy kitchen is actually still running it even to this day. Now they have one more location where we turn to go up to the church. That old smoky candy kitchen up there is their other location. Now we are going to cross the street right here. Whenever you cross the street, it sounds like it's a mall in the mountains. There's a lot of history that took place right here in this area, and there's some paranormal activity that takes place right inside this mountain mall, even to this day. Now, before any of this was here, this was Cherokee land. This was part of their territory. And he decided he was going to go back to South Carolina, not only to retrieve his family, but he wanted to grow one more round of crops for supplies when he came back over. But unfortunately, when he got back to South Carolina in 1803, he caught malaria and he died. So he never did make it back to his land of paradise. But his wife, Martha Jane Husky Ogle, and 7 of her children, along with her brother Peter Husky and some of his family, made their way back over here around 1807, between 1807 and 1811. And they found the logs with instructions from William that he had cut, and they finished that log cabin. Now that log cabin can be seen on display down in front of the visitor center by the big parking garage, right across the street from Old Red. That's the original log cabin, and one of the first ones actually built in this area. Now its original location was about a half mile back behind where it is now. And the family lived in it up until about 1910, and then they finally outgrew it and went on to become a mountain clinic for a couple of years. Then they moved it to where it's at now for people to be able to see when they come into town. Now the great-grandson of the Ogles that first came over here, he had the first commerce here in town. He built the first general store. His name was Noah Ogle. And he built that first general store right up the street past Old Red on the left-hand side, and that was back in the early 1850s. Now, the first person to actually die in this area was named James Bohannon. Now, he was crossing this little Pigeon River behind me here. He had a sack of maple sugar on his shoulder, and he was balancing on a log. That's what they used to cross the river with. And when he fell off that log, hit his head on a rock in the river, and he drowned right there. Well, they buried his body right here where this mountain mall is before any of this was built here. Now, another interesting character that came to town came here in 1854. Now, his name was Bradford Gatlin. Now, when Mr. Gatlin came here, this town was called White Oak Flats. They named it that because of all the white oaks around here. Flats, I'm not so sure why, but white oaks because of the trees. But when Mr. Gatlin came here, he was kind of an arrogant, conceited preacher man. The townspeople didn't like him a whole lot because of his arrogant personality. But not only that, he started doing things to make the townspeople even more angry with him. He had already been kicked out of several towns around here and bought some land here. But the first thing he did is he decided he wanted to open his own general store, and he opened it right across the street from the Ogles General Store. So now we had two competing general stores. But that also made some feuding go back and forth between the Ogles and Gatlins. And things would happen like barns being burned down, animals being killed, fences being torn up. Of course, one family blamed the other and the other blamed one, but nobody could really prove who was doing what to who. So this went on for a little while. But Mr. Gatlin also decided he didn't like the churches here. Since he was a preacher, he was going to start his own church. They called his followers the Gatlinites. But the church didn't last very long because very few people went to it because they didn't like him. And the few people that did like him, and Berg is German for town. So that's how the town name got changed from White Oak Flats to Gatlinburg. Now, the townspeople didn't have a whole lot to say about it, and it seems like once you change something like that through the government, it pretty much stays that way. His property, Mr. Ogle was wanting to run by his property, so there's a little feud about that as well. But Mr. Gatlin got so frustrated with it, he actually took it to court and had a court battle drawn up or whatever over it. And he actually did win that court case, so the main road went by most of his property. But right after that, the townspeople said they had enough of him, and they ended up running him out of town. So he was only here from 1854 to 1859, had this whole town named after him. And about the only thing he contributed is where the main road goes right here. So it really should be named after the Ogles for all they've done, as many of them are still in town, and as many of them as what they do today to keep this town actually going. Now, before Mr. Gatlin was run out of town, he had a house servant that was seen in town a lot. Every time she was seen, she looked malnourished or beaten, and everybody knew that Mr. Gatlin was doing it to her because he wasn't a very nice man. But one day she mysteriously disappeared. And the story goes that she did something to displease Mr. Gatlin, and he just beat her relentlessly until she died. Now, of course, Miss Gatlin, she didn't want to be accused of murder, so she said, why don't you take the body, bury it on the Ogles property, and that way if the body's found, they'll get the blame, or if it comes back to us, we'll have time to get out of town. Well, they believe that she was buried right here in the same grave that James Bohannon was buried in, because this was the Ogles property at the time, and on the day she disappeared, the dirt around James Bohannon's grave was disturbed. So they believe she was buried in that same grave right here. Now in 1910, Mr. Noah Ogle, he decided to move the general store that was up the street here to this location right here. And it said when they moved that general store here, they were looking for that grave so they could move it so they could build that general store here. But everything had grown up so much they never could find the grave. So they ended up building that general store right over top of that grave right here. Now they say in the 70s they tore down that general store and a few cabins that were here to build this mountain mall. And they said they still couldn't find that grave, so they ended up building this mountain mall right over top of that grave as well. So that's probably why those two spirits are haunting this mountain mall even today. They believe James Bohannon, since he drowned in the river, manifests himself as water. And he shows up as wet footprints on the floors and sometimes wet spots on the walls and ceilings. They say also that every now and then you'll see a face in one of the bathroom mirrors. And they believe mirrors are portals that souls can pass through. And they believe maybe he's trying to pass through one of those portals to tell people he's still buried under this mountain mall and maybe he wants to be moved. But as far as the house servant, people say when they're walking around here they can hear singing or humming. When they look over, they see a woman dressed in 1800s clothing that looks malnourished or beaten. And they say after about a minute or so, she just disappears. So people believe that's the house servant that's in here walking around this mountain mall. 92, it really is too busy in town for a church at that location. So they tore it down and they built a new one out on 321 past the Alamo Steakhouse out there. So it's still an active church, but it's a new location.
Wow, that's pretty.
Shadow figures down in the water, sometimes on the banks of the river. They see fishermen out here sometimes. There is fishing in this river. Sometimes you will see fishermen out here. These fishermen, they say, will disappear after a winter or so. And some people even say they see a battered canoe floating down through this river. Then he had a fish trap he was using. He dropped the fish trap in the water. And when he went over to get it, he tripped on one of the loose stones there, and he hit his head on one of the rocks and drowned here in the river. Just like many people died in this river the same way. They say ever since he died here in this river, he's been known to walk the river from one end to the other. They believe he's still looking for his fish trap. They say if you come out here early in the morning and take a photo downstream, you can get a photo of him still looking for his fish trap walking down through this river. And they had a 7-year-old daughter with them. And one night that 7-year-old daughter fell off that balcony using the river here and actually died right here at this location. Now the police came out to investigate and were looking around the river. And either nobody saw what happened or nobody's willing to come forward. And so they kind of took the parents' word that she had fallen off that balcony. But they got to looking up there and realized those rails were off the high. They're kind of like these rails here. They didn't think a girl that age could slip over very easy. And the bars were real close together, so they didn't think she could squeeze through either. Without any witnesses, they didn't have much to go on. The next day, the witnesses came forward to the police station, and they said they had seen the father and the young girl the day before. The father's being really abusive to the girl, beating on her, calling her names, things like that. So they issued a warrant for the father's arrest. They wanted to bring him in and question him a little bit further on his side of the story. So I guess guilt got the better of him because him and his wife, before the police could catch up with him, they jumped in their car and left all their belongings and headed out of town. Now they didn't get but about 3 miles out of town on these steep, windy mountain roads before they ended up flipping their vehicle off the mountain they were going so fast, and they ended up dying in that crash. Now some people believe the little girl was getting revenge for being thrown off the balcony here, and she's the one that caused that accident. Now, things kind of got back to normal here at this hotel until about a year later on the anniversary of the girl's death. There was another family staying here in that same room, and they were looking out the window and they saw a little girl about that age standing out here in the river all by herself. There was no family down below or anybody up on top. So they were concerned and they called the police. When the police came out here, they found no little girl, no footprints, no clothing, no sign of her at all. The water wasn't moving very fast, and it was swept away. Well, things like this happened every year on the anniversary of the girl's death for about 10 years. And after about 10 years, it seemed like the little girl was being neglected and needed more attention. Because she started being seen in the river more often. And every time she was seen, she would point up to the room from which she was thrown. She'd let out a scream. Then she started interacting with people on that third floor from which she was thrown up there. And she started doing things like running up and down the hallways, giggling and knocking on people's doors. And if you answered the door, there'd be nobody standing there to hear her laughing out in the hallway or out in the hallway. But some people said they could hear laughing in their closets and things in their room get moved around. And a couple people even claimed that when they get in a shower, they can see writing in the closet. So, you know, kids love hotels. They believe she's just having fun hanging out here at this hotel. Now, some people say that she doesn't know her parents are dead. She's waiting for their turn, so she's just hanging out here until they come back. Other people say that she does know her parents are dead and just doesn't want to be with them because they were so abusive. So she again, is just hanging out here having fun at this hotel. And this is a great hotel to stay at. I just don't recommend staying on the third floor if you want to go down to sleep, right? Now, close by in this river, we also had another death back when the early settlers in Cherokee were here. There was a shunned Cherokee shaman they called Ama Eskaya. Now, the Cherokee kind of chased him away. The townspeople didn't want nothing to do with him. So he ended up coming here and he killed himself right here in this river. Now, they say if you see him, he has snake eyes, really big feet, looks really old. So that's what he looks like here at this river. Now, here, and grab people with the land of the river. They say that kind of one of the Cherokees disappeared and come over here and walk up and down the river, burning the sand, trying to get rid of all the back and stop running here in the river. The Cherokees were pretty calm, but he never wanted to do anything. They ended up finding his body right here in the river and downstream a little bit further. And some people say maybe this guy came in the water and grabbed him. That's actually what caused his death here in the river. So if you're walking close to this water or down here on the sidewalk by the river, just be aware of either one of those spirits. We just don't want to need another death right here in this river, right? This right here is the Gatlinburg Spirit Mansion. If you're walking through here, sometimes you'll see something a little extra. They believe that the get enough attention at the hotel, she'll come over here and interact with people over here. Several people that work here said they've seen a girl about that age kind of all over through with their family. They believe that was her. But they also told me that when the family left, the couple belonged to a little boy's doll about 9 they have it inside here in a glass case. So maybe it's going to be close to her doll, maybe she wants to get it back. And that's why she's being seen here in this hotel. Pretty close to under this skylift here is where there's been a couple deaths reported in this river. And a lot of people, when they walk by, especially close to the river here, they get readings there as well. Kircher to come here and build a skylift right here. And Mr. Kircher bought a skylift from California, and he brought it here and reassembled it here in this location. And that was in 1954. Now, this skylift just had single seaters. Those chairs could only carry one person at a time. Not long after that, they made them two-seaters because tourism was picking up. But in 2016, they were going to make them three-seaters because they were going to build a sky bridge, concession stand, walkway, and things like that up there. And they had planned on doing it in phases. But we had a pretty major fire here that burned about 17,000 acres around the Gatlinburg area. It missed the town, but it did get pretty close. It actually burned the whole top of this mountain right here and halfway down that sky lift. And because of that, they had to redo everything at one time. So they finished the sky lift in 2017, finished the sky bridge in 2019. At the beginning of last year, they opened up a walkway that goes from one side of the bridge down the mountain to the other side of the bridge. So you can walk around one or the other or both out there. And you might want to check out the empty signs about the fire. He's related to Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett's sister married into the Maples family. And down in their lineage, they have a Davy Crockett Maples Sr. Here in town, we have Crockett's Breakfast Camp, which was actually named after Davy Crockett Maples Sr. And he was one of these tough old mountain men. You can read about him in the restaurant, and they have a little statue of him outside. But in order to escape the snowstorm, he crawled up inside a hollowed out log so he wouldn't get frostbite. But unfortunately, the bottom part of his leg stuck out, and he did get frostbite on those. So when he came into town, they had to amputate the bottom part of both his legs. Now, him being one of these tough old mountain men, he went out and cut some wood, and made him some wooden legs with little boots carved in them, and a couple wooden walking sticks, and he got around the rest of his life like that. So they were tough back in those days, right? So
Yeah.
this way. Can y'all handle it? Y'all looking at me funny. Blame it all on being an old hotel. They say they hear creaks and moans in here at night. Sometimes lights will flicker in your room. Sometimes TVs will come on at midnight. They say faucets sometimes will turn on by themselves. When we turn the faucets off, they come back on again. It's a lot of crazy stuff here, but people say, you know, it's an old hotel. Things like that are going to happen, right? But there's a few things that happen here also that people can't explain away so easily. The first thing I'll tell you about is they say there's a laughing girl that stands at the end of one of the hallways. She stands there facing the wall, just facing it, just laughing for about a minute or so, and then she just walks in the wall and disappears. Now nobody knows for sure who she is or why she's here, but urban legend says if you look at the girl while she's laughing, she turns around, looks at you, you'll have horrible luck the next day. So I don't recommend looking at anybody laughing in that hotel just in case, right? Can't be too safe. They also say if you're taking a late night dip out here in this swimming pool, that sometimes you'll feel a cramp or a pain in your side. Let him pass. Another story in the making, I'm sure. But they say when you're swimming here, sometimes you'll feel a cramp or a pain in your side, and it causes you to look down the bottom of the pool. When you do, you see about 11 or 12-year-old boy down there in tattered clothing. They say he'll reach up for you and let out a silent scream and nothing but bubbles. Now, there's been no deaths reported here, so people don't know why he's showing up there. But people say maybe there's some type of vortex or portal here that's drawing all that activity here. That's why people are seeing different things here. But other people also blame it on a demon that haunts this hotel. They say there's a demon in here that haunts room 111. That demon first showed up when somebody was taking a shower one night, and they were pushed against the shower wall. Then they felt this searing pain in their back. When they got out of the shower, they saw 3 scratches across their back. Anytime there's 3 scratches, that's the sign of a demon attack. So they believe they were attacked by a demon right there in that room. Now there's another person staying there that said they woke up at midnight because they heard this noise over at the doorway. When they looked over, they saw a shadow figure standing at the doorway. The shadow figure started to walk up the wall and across the ceiling, and then got right over top of his bed and then just disappeared. Now he said somehow or another he fell back asleep. I don't think I would have. I didn't put my sign to leave the hotel, right? But he said then he woke up at 3 o'clock, and now he felt paralyzed and couldn't move. He said that the shadow figure was now standing beside his bed, and it kind of smelled like a rotting corpse and kind of looked like one too. Then all of a sudden, they leaned across the bed, screamed right in his face, and then just vanished. Now they had so much activity that was happening in that room 111, they called in a nearby church, St. Mary's, just past the convention center. They called them in to do an exorcism in that room. They wanted to get rid of that demon. So when the church came down here and did that exorcism, after that, things were still happening just as bad. So they called the church back and had them come down and do a second exorcism, hoping that that would work. After the second exorcism, things kind of calmed down a little bit, but there was still some activity going there. So they consulted the church to find out if they'd come back and do a third one. And the church was trying to find out what went wrong. Now they were recording everything that was going on during those exorcisms. So they were playing back the recordings. And during the second recording, they kept hearing somebody in Latin kept repeating, "I will never leave, I will never leave, I will never leave." And so they believed that to be true and didn't want to waste their time trying to do another exorcism. So they never did come back and do a third one. And so things are still happening in that hotel even to this day. Now the last time we heard anything was when somebody was staying there one night. He had heard stories about the demon and didn't believe in him. He's just kind of making fun of him. And all of a sudden one of the dresser drawers came out and hit him right in the chest. Of course he became a believer real quick. He packed his stuff and left the hotel that night. I don't think I'd have been taught the demon whether I believed or not, even if I thought there was something in that room, right? So there's a lot of activity happening here, but it's not all bad at this hotel. How many of you know that song Rocky Top? Good old Rocky Top, Tennessee. It was actually written right here in this hotel back in 1967. There was a couple named Felice and Boudreaux Bryant that lived over in Nashville, and they would come over here. They befriended the Maples family here, and they would toss them the keys to room 388. They'd go up there and sing and they write rock songs over here. But in their career, they wrote about 1,500 altogether. They wrote songs for people like Buddy Holly, Everly Brothers, songs like Wake Up Little Susie, Bye Bye Love, and Dreams by Them. And when they remodeled this hotel in 2016, they left that room the same. So you can see how they used to stay when they were here, and they have a little plaque that talks about it here.
He sees you.